The Montana Territory stretched endless under a sky so wide it seemed to swallow hope itself. Winter of 1882 brought the kind of cold that turned breath to crystals and made even the strongest men question their choices. But for Nathaniel Cross, cold was just another day at the Triple Crown Ranch, the sprawling empire he had carved from nothing but grit and an iron will that bent to no one. Standing 6'3" in his worn leather boots, Nathaniel commanded respect without asking for it. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass, and his eyes, the color of storm clouds, held secrets that most folks were too smart to ask about. At 35, he was the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, with cattle that numbered in the thousands and land that stretched beyond the horizon. But wealth had a way of attracting the wrong kind of attention. The parlor of the Cross Mansion was lined with mahogany and adorned with crystal chandeliers that caught the firelight like trapped stars. Tonight, like so many nights before, it played host to another parade of hopeful brides and their ambitious fathers. Men in fine suits clutched contracts and dowry agreements, their daughters beside them in silk gowns that cost more than most families saw in a year. "Mr. Cross," announced Harold Pemberton, a railroad baron from Denver, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. "May I present my daughter, Victoria? She speaks 3 languages and plays piano like an angel." Victoria Pemberton stepped forward, her golden hair perfectly coiffed, her blue eyes bright with practiced charm. She curtsied with the grace of finishing school training, her smile wide and expectant. "It's such an honor to meet you, Mr. Cross. Father says you have the most magnificent ranch in all of Montana." Nathaniel barely glanced up from the ledger he was reviewing. His pen scratched across the page with deliberate precision. "Miss Pemberton," he said without lifting his eyes, "I'm sure your father has told you many things." The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Victoria's smile flickered, uncertainty creeping into her perfectly composed features. Her father cleared his throat loudly, the sound echoing in the cavernous room. "Victoria has been educated at the finest institutions," Harold pressed on, desperation creeping into his voice. "She would make an excellent wife for a man of your standing." "Would she now?" Nathaniel finally looked up, his gray eyes cold as winter steel. "And what makes you think I'm in the market for a wife, Mr. Pemberton?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Victoria's cheeks flushed pink, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her skirts. Her father's face darkened, his jaw clenching with barely contained frustration. "Every man needs a wife, Cross, someone to manage his household, bear his children, secure his legacy." Nathaniel set down his pen with deliberate care and rose from his chair. His presence filled the room like a gathering storm. "My household runs itself, Mr. Pemberton. My legacy is carved in stone and steel, not in the whims of society marriages. And as for children," he paused, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "I have no intention of bringing souls into this world to inherit my particular brand of loneliness." Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Her father's face went from red to purple, his fists clenching at his sides. "You're making a mistake, Cross. Victoria is the finest woman you'll ever meet. Beautiful, educated, connected to the best families in the country." "The finest woman I'll ever meet." Nathaniel's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Mr. Pemberton, your daughter is a lovely ornament, I'm sure, but I'm not looking to decorate my mantle. I'm looking for something real, something that can't be bought or sold or arranged over brandy and cigars." Harold Pemberton drew himself up to his full height, which still left him several inches shorter than Nathaniel. "You'll regret this, Cross. A man can't live alone forever. You'll die bitter and forgotten." "Perhaps," Nathaniel said, walking to the window that overlooked his vast domain, "but I'll die free." The Pembertons left in a whirlwind of rustling silk and muttered threats. But they were not the first, and they would not be the last. For 3 years, the wealthy families of the territory had been sending their daughters to the Triple Crown Ranch, each convinced they had the perfect bride for the untamable Nathaniel Cross. There had been Margaret Thornfield, the banker's daughter from Billings, who spoke of nothing but the latest fashions from Paris and fainted at the sight of a branding iron. Catherine Westbrook, the judge's daughter from Helena, who demanded servants for every conceivable task and refused to step foot in the stables because they smelled of honest work. Elizabeth Cartwright, the merchant's daughter from Bozeman, who calculated the worth of every piece of furniture in the house and asked pointed questions about his will. Each one had been beautiful in their own way, educated, refined, connected to powerful families. Each one had been politely but firmly refused. The pattern had become so predictable that the ranch hands had started taking bets on how long each suitor would last before being shown the door. "Boss sure has a way of sending them packing," chuckled Tom Bradley, the ranch foreman, as he watched the Pemberton carriage disappear down the long drive. "That's what, 12 this month." 15, corrected Miguel Santos, the head wrangler, as he leaned against the fence post. "Don't forget the 3 that came last week." That little blonde one cried so hard she soaked through her handkerchief. The men laughed, but there was an undercurrent of concern in their voices. They had worked for Nathaniel Cross for years, had seen him build this empire from nothing, had watched him weather storms both literal and metaphorical. But they had also seen the way he stood alone at his window each night, staring out at the endless expanse of his land with an expression that spoke of depths they couldn't fathom. "He's a good man," Tom said quietly. "Pays fair, treats us right, never asks us to do anything he wouldn't do himself. But there's something eating at him, something that goes deeper than just not wanting to get married." Miguel nodded slowly. "My Maria, she says a man needs more than cattle and land to make a life. Says he's looking for something these fancy ladies can't give him." "And what's that?" "Truth," Miguel said simply. "These women, they come here wanting to be the wife of a rich rancher. They don't want to know the man behind the money. They see the mansion, the cattle, the reputation, but they don't see the scars." It was true. Nathaniel Cross carried scars that went deeper than the physical marks left by years of hard labor and dangerous work. There were scars on his soul, carved by betrayal and loss, by the weight of responsibility and the isolation that came with power. The women who came to court him saw only the surface, the success story, the prize to be won. They didn't see the young man who had arrived in Montana with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of dreams. They didn't see the nights he had spent sleeping under the stars, building his fortune one cow at a time, 1 acre at a time, one difficult decision at a time. They didn't see the loneliness that had settled into his bones like winter cold, the way he had learned to protect himself by keeping everyone at arm's length. Most of all, they didn't see the hope that still flickered somewhere deep inside him, the part of him that still believed in the possibility of finding someone who would see past the wealth and the reputation to the man underneath. That hope had been buried under years of disappointment, but it refused to die completely. It whispered to him in the quiet moments before dawn, when the world was still and the only sound was the wind through the grass. It reminded him that somewhere out there might be someone who would love him not for what he had built, but for who he was. But as winter deepened and the parade of suitors continued, that hope grew fainter with each passing day. The women who came to his door were beautiful, accomplished, everything society said a man should want. But they were also hollow, their smiles practiced, their interest calculated, their hearts focused on everything except the man they claimed to want to marry. Nathaniel had begun to believe that perhaps Harold Pemberton was right. Perhaps he would die alone, bitter and forgotten. Perhaps he was asking for something that didn't exist, something that belonged only in the stories his mother used to tell him before she died, stories of love that conquered all obstacles and hearts that recognized each other across any distance. The snow began to fall as evening approached, large flakes drifting down like pieces of a torn letter from heaven. Nathaniel stood at his window, watching the white blanket settle over his domain, feeling the familiar weight of solitude pressing down on his shoulders. Tomorrow would bring another day, another potential suitor, another disappointment. But tonight, as the wind howled across the prairie and the fire crackled in the hearth behind him, Nathaniel Cross allowed himself to wonder if somewhere out there in the vast Montana territory, there was someone who might see past the walls he had built around his heart. Someone who might approach his gate not seeking his wealth or his status, but seeking the man who had been waiting, alone and guarded, for someone brave enough to look beyond the surface. The thought was dangerous, he knew. Hope was a luxury he could not afford. But as the snow continued to fall and the night deepened around him, Nathaniel Cross found himself unable to shake the feeling that change was coming, carried on the winter wind like a whispered promise. The morning arrived with the kind of stillness that made every sound carry for miles. Nathaniel woke before dawn, as was his habit, and dressed in the darkness of his room. The routine was sacred to him, unchanging as the sunrise itself. Boots, worn leather that had molded to his feet over years of hard use. Shirt, flannel that had been washed and mended so many times the original blue had faded to the color of old denim. belt with the silver buckle his father had given him before consumption took him 20 years ago. He moved through the house like a ghost, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpets that seemed out of place in a man's sanctuary. The mansion had been built to impress with its soaring ceilings and imported fixtures, but Nathaniel had never felt at home in its grandeur. It was a monument to success, not a sanctuary for the soul. The kitchen was empty at this hour, the cook still asleep in her quarters above the stable. Nathaniel preferred it this way, the solitude of dawn, the coffee he made himself in the cast-iron pot that had traveled with him from his first-line shack. The bitter liquid scalded his throat, but it was honest pain, the kind that reminded him he was alive. Through the window, he could see his foreman Tom Bradley already moving among the cattle, checking the animals that had been brought closer to the barn for the winter. The man was dependable as sunrise, had been with Nathaniel since the early days when the ranch was nothing but hope and stubbornness. Tom understood the rhythm of the work, the way cattle needed tending, the way land demanded respect. But even Tom, for all his loyalty, kept his distance from the deeper currents of Nathaniel's life. They spoke of weather and cattle prices, of broken fences and sick animals, of the practical matters that kept the ranch running. They did not speak of the emptiness that echoed through the big house, or the way Nathaniel sometimes stood at his window until the small hours, watching the stars wheel overhead like distant promises. The front door opened with a creak that seemed to announce the arrival of another day, another round of obligations and expectations. Nathaniel stepped onto the wide porch, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The snow had stopped falling, but it lay thick on the ground, unmarked except for the tracks of small animals and the deep furrows left by the wagon wheels of yesterday's departed suitors. In the distance, smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney, a thin gray line against the pale sky. The hands would be stirring soon, preparing for another day of winter work. Cattle to be fed, water to be chopped from frozen troughs, equipment to be maintained and repaired. The work never ended, and Nathaniel found comfort in its constancy. But today felt different somehow, charged with possibility in a way that made his skin prickle with awareness. He had learned to trust these feelings over the years, the way a man learned to read the sky for signs of coming weather. Something was shifting in the careful balance of his world, though he could not yet name what it might be. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his thoughts. Nathaniel straightened, his jaw tightening with familiar resignation. Another day, another parade of ambitious fathers and their calculating daughters. He had grown weary of the game, the elaborate dance of courtship that had nothing to do with genuine feeling and everything to do with social advancement and financial security. But as the rider came into view, Nathaniel found himself frowning in confusion. This was not the usual ornate carriage filled with silk and perfume. Instead, a single figure approached on horseback, moving with the easy grace of someone who had been born to the saddle. The horse was a sturdy paint, well cared for but not fancy, the kind of animal that valued endurance over appearance. The rider was small, bundled in a coat that had seen better days but was clean and carefully mended. A worn hat was pulled low against the wind, casting shadows that made it impossible to make out the features beneath. But there was something in the way the figure sat the horse, something in the careful approach that spoke of respect rather than presumption. Nathaniel watched from the porch as the rider dismounted at the gate, movements efficient and unhurried. No grand gestures, no theatrical flourishes designed to catch his attention. Just a simple, honest action performed with quiet competence. The figure tied the horse to the post with practiced ease, then stood for a moment, seeming to gather courage before approaching the house. As the visitor drew closer, Nathaniel realized with a start that this was a woman, though she moved with none of the affected grace he had come to expect from his usual suitors. Her steps were steady, purposeful, the walk of someone accustomed to covering ground on her own 2 feet. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that spoke of inner strength rather than social training. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, close enough now that Nathaniel could see her face beneath the brim of her hat. She was young, perhaps 25, with features that were pleasant rather than striking. Her skin had been touched by sun and wind, marked by the kind of honest work that most ladies of his acquaintance would have considered beneath their station. Her eyes were brown, warm and direct, without the calculated sparkle he had learned to distrust. "Mr. Cross," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying easily in the crisp morning air, "my name is Sarah Mitchell. I've come to speak with you if you have a moment." There was no flutter of eyelashes, no coy smile designed to disarm him. Just a simple request delivered with the straightforward honesty of someone who had no hidden agenda. Nathaniel found himself studying her face, searching for the telltale signs of artifice he had learned to recognize. But there was something refreshingly genuine about her manner, something that made him hesitate before delivering his usual dismissal. "Miss Mitchell," he said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated wariness. "I assume you know why most young ladies come to call on me." A smile touched the corners of her mouth, but it was not the practiced expression he had come to expect. Instead, it seemed to hold a touch of genuine amusement, as if she understood something about his situation that others had missed. "I imagine they come hoping to marry you," she said simply. "But that's not why I'm here." The words hit Nathaniel like a physical blow, so unexpected that he found himself taking a step backward. In 3 years of receiving suitors, no one had ever opened a conversation with such direct honesty. They all came with elaborate pretenses, claiming to admire his character or his accomplishments, dancing around their true intentions with the practiced grace of social butterflies. "Then why are you here?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Sarah Mitchell looked up at him steadily, her brown eyes holding secrets of their own. "Because I've heard things about you, Mr. Cross. Things that make me think you might be the kind of man who would understand what it means to be truly alone." The words hung in the frigid air between them, heavy with implication. Nathaniel felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the careful control he had maintained for so long. This woman, this unexpected visitor who had appeared at his gate like an answer to a prayer he had been afraid to voice, seemed to see straight through the walls he had built around himself. "And what makes you think," he said slowly, "that I would be interested in discussing such things with a stranger?" Sarah's smile deepened, transforming her plain features into something approaching beauty. "Because, Mr. Cross, I don't think you've met anyone in a very long time who wasn't trying to take something from you. And I think you might be curious about what it would feel like to talk to someone who wants to give you something instead." The words struck Nathaniel like lightning illuminating a dark prairie. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at this woman who had just shattered every assumption he had built about human nature. The morning air seemed to crystallize around them, each breath visible in the space between question and answer. "Give me something," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "And what exactly do you think I need that you could possibly offer?" Sarah Mitchell shifted slightly, her worn boots crunching in the snow. She didn't look away from his gaze, didn't fidget with her coat or smooth her hair like the others always did. Instead, she stood perfectly still, as if she had all the time in the world to answer a question that might change everything. "Understanding," she said simply, "the kind that doesn't come with conditions or expectations or plans for what you should do with it afterward." Nathaniel felt his carefully constructed defenses wavering. 3 years of practiced responses, of cold dismissals and cutting remarks, suddenly seemed inadequate. This woman wasn't playing by the rules he had learned to navigate. She wasn't asking for anything, wasn't positioning herself as a prize to be won or a solution to his problems. "You don't know anything about me," he said, but the words lacked their usual bite. "You don't know what I've done, what I've seen, what I've become." "You're right," Sarah agreed, nodding slowly. "I don't know your story, but I know what it looks like when someone has been carrying weight too heavy for one person to bear. I know what it sounds like when a man's laughter has forgotten how to reach his eyes. And I know what it feels like to watch the world from behind walls so high that even you can't remember how to climb over them." The accuracy of her words hit him like a physical blow. Nathaniel gripped the porch railing, his knuckles white against the painted wood. How could this stranger, this woman who had appeared at his gate like morning mist, see so clearly what others had missed entirely? "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice rougher now, edged with something that might have been desperation. Sarah took a step closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, the way the cold had painted roses on her cheeks. "I want to tell you about a woman who lost everything she thought mattered, and discovered that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you actually need." "Your story," Nathaniel said, understanding beginning to dawn like sunrise over the mountains. "My story," she confirmed, "and maybe, if you're willing to listen, you might tell me yours, not because either of us is trying to fix the other, but because sometimes the weight gets a little lighter when someone else helps carry it for a while." Nathaniel stared at her for a long moment, this woman who had somehow managed to walk through his defenses as if they were made of morning fog. Everything about her was wrong by the standards he had learned to apply. Her clothes were practical rather than fashionable, her hands showed the calluses of real work, her face bore the marks of weather and worry rather than pampered perfection. But there was something in her eyes, something that recognized the darkness in his own and wasn't afraid of it. Something that looked at his carefully maintained isolation and saw not a fortress to be conquered, but a prison to be understood. "Why," he asked finally, "why would you want to sit with someone else's darkness?" Sarah's smile was sad and knowing, touched with the kind of wisdom that only came from walking through fire and emerging changed. "Because I've been sitting with my own for so long that I forgot what it felt like to share the load, because loneliness is a hungry thing and it feeds on silence, and because sometimes, Mr. Cross, the only way to find your way back to the light is to stop pretending you're not lost in the dark." The wind picked up, swirling snow around their feet like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. Nathaniel felt something cracking inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid for longer than he cared to remember. This woman, this unexpected visitor who had approached his gate with nothing but honesty and an offer to share stories, was offering him something he had almost forgotten existed. Connection, real, honest, unvarnished connection with another human being who understood what it meant to carry scars that never quite healed. "I should warn you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of accumulated pain, "that my story isn't a pretty one. It's full of choices I'm not proud of, people I've hurt, bridges I've burned because it seemed easier than learning how to trust." "Neither is mine," Sarah replied simply. "But pretty stories don't teach us much about how to live with the ugly parts of ourselves, and I think we've both had enough of pretty lies to last a lifetime." Nathaniel looked at her standing there in the snow, this woman who had somehow managed to see past everything he had built to protect himself. She wasn't offering him salvation or demanding that he become someone different. She was simply offering to sit with him in the darkness and share the weight of whatever they might find there. "There's coffee inside," he said finally, the words feeling strange in his mouth after so many years of sending visitors away. "It's strong and bitter, but it's honest." Sarah's smile transformed her entire face, revealing a beauty that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with the kind of joy that survived in spite of everything life threw at it. "Honest coffee sounds perfect," she said. "I've had enough of things that taste sweet but leave you feeling empty afterward." As they climbed the steps together, Nathaniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not hope exactly, but something quieter and more sustainable. The possibility that perhaps he didn't have to carry his burdens alone forever. The chance that maybe, just maybe, he had found someone who would sit with him in the darkness without trying to drag him into the light before he was ready. The door closed behind them with a soft click, sealing out the cold and the wind and the endless expectations of a world that had never quite understood what Nathaniel Cross was looking for. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls like promises of warmth to come. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Nathaniel Cross didn't feel quite so alone. The kitchen felt different with Sarah Mitchell in it. The same cast iron stove, the same wooden table worn smooth by years of use, the same window that looked out over the snow-covered pastures. But somehow the space seemed less empty, less like a monument to solitude, and more like a place where two people might actually sit and share something real. Nathaniel poured coffee into 2 tin cups, the bitter liquid steaming in the cold air. His hands were steady, but inside he felt off balance, as if the careful rhythm of his life had suddenly shifted into a different key. He had grown so accustomed to the armor of isolation that he had forgotten how vulnerable it felt to let someone else into his private spaces. Sarah accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, wrapping her work-roughened hands around the warm metal. She didn't comment on the sparse furnishings or the way the kitchen seemed designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Instead, she simply stood there, letting the heat seep into her fingers, waiting for him to decide what came next. "You said you wanted to tell me your story," Nathaniel said, settling against the counter with his own cup. "I'm listening." Sarah looked out the window at the vast expanse of snow and sky, her expression growing distant. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of memory, of choices made and consequences faced. "I was married once," she began, the words falling into the quiet kitchen like stones into still water, "to a man named David Mitchell, good man, or so I thought, owned a small farm about 50 miles south of here, raised wheat, and kept a few head of cattle. We had plans, the kind of dreams that young people make when they think the world owes them happiness. She paused, taking a sip of coffee that seemed to steady her. We were married 3 years, happy years mostly. David was kind, hardworking, everything a woman was supposed to want in a husband. We were trying to have children, talking about expanding the farm, building a life that would last. Nathaniel waited, sensing that the difficult part was coming. There was something in the way Sarah held herself, a tension that spoke of pain carefully contained. Then the drought came, she continued. 2 years of it, crops failing, cattle dying, neighbors packing up and heading east. David tried everything, borrowed money we didn't have, worked himself to exhaustion trying to save what we'd built, but the land was dying and there was nothing any of us could do about it. Her voice grew quieter, more distant. That's when I learned something about my husband that I'd never seen before. When things got desperate, when the pressure became too much, David wasn't the man I thought I'd married. He started drinking, started blaming me for our troubles. Said if I'd been a better wife, if I'd given him sons to help with the work, maybe things would have been different. Nathaniel felt anger rising in his chest, a protective instinct he hadn't experienced in years. He blamed you for the drought. Sarah's laugh was bitter as winter wind. He blamed me for everything, the failed crops, the dead cattle, the debts that kept mounting, said I was cursed, that I'd brought bad luck to his family's land. The drinking got worse, and when he drank, he got mean. Started hitting me, telling me I was worthless, that no other man would ever want damaged goods like me. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow, faded but still visible. This one was from a broken bottle. He threw it at me during one of his rages, said I'd ruined his life and he was going to make sure I paid for it. Nathaniel set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, his hands trembling with barely contained fury. Where is he now? Dead, Sarah said simply. Fell off his horse coming home drunk one night, broke his neck. They found him in the morning, lying in a ditch like the piece of garbage he'd become. The words hung between them, heavy with years of pain and complicated grief. Nathaniel could see the toll the telling had taken on her, the way her shoulders sagged as if she had set down a weight she had been carrying for too long. I'm sorry, he said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. No one should have to live through that. Sarah shrugged, but there was no dismissal in the gesture. The worst part wasn't the hitting, she said. It was the way he made me believe for a while that maybe he was right. Maybe I was cursed, maybe I was the reason everything went wrong. It took me a long time to understand that David's cruelty said everything about who he was and nothing about who I was. How long? Nathaniel asked. 2 years after he died, I was still living on that farm, still trying to make it work, still believing that if I just tried harder, worked longer, suffered more, maybe I could prove that I wasn't the failure he'd convinced me I was. I nearly starved that winter, too proud to ask for help, too broken to believe I deserved any. She looked at him directly then, her brown eyes steady and clear. That's when I learned something important about loneliness, Mr. Cross. It's not just about being alone. It's about being convinced that you deserve to be alone, that you're not worthy of connection or kindness or love. It's about building walls so high that even you can't see over them anymore. Nathaniel felt those words settle into his bones like recognition. What changed? My neighbor, an old woman named Mrs. Patterson, came by one day and found me collapsed in the barn. I hadn't eaten in 3 days, was burning furniture to keep warm because I was too weak to chop wood. She took one look at me and said, "Child, you're not honoring your husband's memory by killing yourself slowly. You're just letting his poison finish the job he started." Sarah's voice grew stronger, more certain. She helped me sell the farm, helped me start over. Told me that sometimes the only way to heal from being broken is to stop trying to put the pieces back together exactly the way they were before. Sometimes you have to build something entirely new. And did you build something new? I'm trying, Sarah said. I work for a family about 20 miles from here, help raise their children, manage their household. It's good work, honest work, and they treat me with respect. But I'm still learning how to trust again, how to believe that not everyone who shows kindness has an agenda. How to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. Nathaniel nodded slowly, understanding more than he wanted to admit, and that's why you came here. Because you thought I might understand what it feels like to be waiting for that shoe. I came here, Sarah said, because I heard stories about a man who had everything the world said he should want but still stood alone at his window every night like he was waiting for something that never came. I came because I recognized that particular kind of loneliness, and I thought maybe we could sit with it together for a while. The honesty of her words hit him like a physical blow. Nathaniel realized that in all his years of building walls, of protecting himself from the pain of human connection, he had never met anyone who understood the specific quality of his isolation. The way wealth and success could become their own kind of prison, the way having everything could somehow make you feel like you had nothing at all. "You're right," he said finally. "I do stand at that window. Every night watching the stars and wondering if this is all there is, if this emptiness is the price of everything I've built." "And what do you see when you look out there?" Sarah asked gently. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it held answers he had been searching for. "I see land that I own but don't really belong to, cattle that know my voice but not my heart. A house full of beautiful things that feel like they belong to someone else. And I wonder if maybe the cost of protecting myself from being hurt again was giving up any chance of feeling truly alive." Sarah moved closer, her footsteps soft on the worn wooden floor. "Tell me about the hurt," she said quietly, "the one that made you decide protection was worth more than connection." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, the familiar walls beginning to rise. But something in her voice, something patient and undemanding, made him pause. He had spent so many years guarding his secrets that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to consider sharing them. "Her name was Catherine," he said finally, the words scraping his throat like broken glass. "Catherine Fairweather. I was 23, still believing that love could conquer anything if you just wanted it enough. She was beautiful, educated, everything a young man with big dreams thought he needed." Sarah waited, her brown eyes steady on his face. No judgment, no impatience, just the quiet presence of someone who understood that some stories took time to tell. "I loved her completely," Nathaniel continued, his voice growing rougher. "Built this whole ranch thinking about the life we'd have together. Every fence post I set, every acre I cleared, every dollar I saved was for her, for us. I was going to ask her to marry me, had the ring and everything." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Found out she'd been seeing someone else the whole time, a lawyer from back east, someone with family money and social connections. Someone who could give her the kind of life she really wanted, without making her wait for it to be built from nothing. Sarah's expression softened, but she didn't offer empty comfort. "How did you find out?" "Saw them together at the spring dance. She was wearing a dress I'd never seen before, laughing at his jokes like I'd never heard her laugh with me. When I confronted her, she didn't even try to deny it. Just looked at me with this expression like I was something pitiful she'd outgrown." The memory still stung, even after all these years. Nathaniel could still see Catherine's face that night, the way she had looked at him with a mixture of guilt and relief, as if she had finally found an excuse to end something that had become inconvenient. She said I was a nice man, but that nice wasn't enough, that she needed security, stability, someone who could give her a real life instead of just promises and dreams. Said she hoped I'd understand someday that what we had was just youthful foolishness. "And you decided never to be foolish again," Sarah said, understanding threading through her voice. "I decided never to be vulnerable again," Nathaniel corrected. "I threw myself into building this place, making money, becoming the kind of man who could never be dismissed as not good enough. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that success without someone to share it with is just another kind of poverty." They stood in the quiet kitchen, two wounded souls who had found each other across the vast loneliness of the Montana Territory. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and reminding them both of the cold world that waited beyond these walls. "What now?" Nathaniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where do two people like us go from here?" Sarah stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, the way her lips curved in a smile that held both sadness and hope. "We start with the truth," she said simply. "The truth that we're both scared, both broken, both tired of carrying our burdens alone, and maybe, if we're brave enough, we learn to carry them together." Nathaniel felt something shift inside his chest, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to trust someone completely, to let down his guard and discover that the world didn't end when he stopped protecting himself from it. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I've forgotten how to let someone in." "Then we'll figure it out together," Sarah said, reaching out to touch his hand. Her fingers were warm, real, anchoring him to a moment that felt like the beginning of something he had almost given up hoping for. As the snow continued to fall outside, and the fire crackled in the hearth, Nathaniel Cross realized that sometimes the most unexpected gifts came wrapped in the simplest packages. Not in silk and jewels, but in honesty and understanding. Not in grand gestures, but in the quiet courage of someone willing to sit with you in the darkness until you remembered how to find your way back to the light. The rich, cold cowboy who had refused every bride had finally found what he had been searching for all along. Not a woman to complete him, but a companion to walk beside him as they both learned to heal from the wounds that had shaped them. And in the warmth of that kitchen, surrounded by the endless Montana sky, two lonely hearts began to beat in rhythm, creating their own kind of music in the silence they had both grown tired of carrying alone.